Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. This will be a totally spoiler-free video. I'm just going to be talking about various aspects of this series so you can decide if it's for you or not, and give you some of my own experience reading it in case you're interested. So this is a 7-book series plus 1 novella, and the final book, the 7th book, The Dark Tower, was published in 2004. The novella was published later on in 2014, and it's considered book 4.5 in this series, so it kind of fits in the middle. And this series follows a man named Roland. It starts out following a man named Roland, a gunslinger, who is chasing a man in black across a desert, but his ultimate destination is to make it to the Dark Tower. And he makes some companions along the way. And so this series is interesting in that there are several literary allusions, including the Robert Browning poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, the T.S. Eliot poem, The Wasteland. The 3rd book in the series is actually called The Wastelands, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, as well as several modern works of literature and several of King's own books. And there are major spoilers for several of King's own books, especially book 5, Wolves of the Kala, which is kind of a continuation of Salem's Lot. Highly recommended to read that book beforehand. And I think another thing that's also really interesting about this series is the way it blends genres. So if you read book 1, you might get the impression that this is just a Western dystopian fantasy series, and it's so much more than that. The Western aspects are very prominent throughout the series, but there's also a blend of, I would say, urban fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, portal fantasy. Horror is also blended in there, plus some metafiction. So it does get weirder and weirder as you go on, especially as this is a series about kind of a fantasy world blending and merging with the real world, and then some other kind of twisted things along the way. So there are some very strange things that happen. It does get very weird. And the first book, although you don't quite get the scope of that in that first book, I do think there's probably a lot of foreshadowing. It has been a while since I read book 1, but I think book 2 gets a lot of attention because that's when you get introduced to a lot of the main characters in the series, in addition to Roland. So that second book really starts to give you a sense of where this is going and how this opens up. And that leads to talking about characters, because the character work in this series is fantastic. The characters are so vivid, so convincing. They're each so well developed. At least the main characters, they're very well developed in and of themselves, but also the way they relate to one another, the way that they bond with one another, the way that they have challenges with one another, and trust with one another, conflict with one another, is so convincing. Each of the characters deals with his or her own trauma and with his or her own challenges with certain mental health situations. I think addiction is a huge theme in the series that you see played out through many characters, as well as other mental health challenges, psychological challenges. And you also see other themes such as, of course, fate and time, and I would say also loyalty, death, renewal, and relationships with family, both found family, which is a big part of the series, and even with real family members. And there are some very uncomfortable dynamics regarding that, so just be prepared and look into trigger warnings. I come to expect some of those things when I read Stephen King, so they don't quite faze me as much as I think some readers might be fazed, but there are some very uncomfortable things that happen, and very sexually triggering uncomfortable things that happen. So those things are important to keep in mind. But overall, another thing that I think is also a huge strength in this series has to do with the structure. So this is a huge highlight for me personally. I really love it when an author does something different with each book in a series and doesn't follow the same exact structure for every single book. I really enjoy kind of breaking out of the formula, so to speak, and King really does that in this series. He takes a lot of risks with that. Just to give you a general overview, the gunslinger really is kind of Roland's story. We get that Western sort of dystopian fantasy I mentioned, but book 2, we start to see more of the portal fantasy open up. We get more blends into the modern world, and then book 3 feels kind of like a Tolkien quest journey with a horror twist and our found family. And then book 4 is a framed narrative in which we get Roland's backstory. And then book 5, we get a whole side quest. and a lot of other interesting things that happen. Things start to take a meta turn towards the end of that book. And then in book 6, we get a song, and it's even called Song of Susanna. It's even structured like a song. So each part in the book is called a stanza. And then book 7, The Dark Tower itself, is kind of the resolution of everything, but he introduces more weird stuff and even more terminology in that book. And while you have this very interesting structure and you have a blend of genres and so many weird things that happen, including very weird meta things that happen and absurdist things that happen, you still get a very distinct fantasy feeling in the series. I mean, you still have your castles, you still have your villains, you still have your magical items, and you have your animal companion and your found family. And the animal companion, by the way, is the best. He is my favorite animal companion ever, a Billy Bumbler named Oi. So many things are blended together in this series. And now to talk about my experience with this. So first of all, I'll just talk about the last book. I'll go backwards, and I did already do a video on books 1 through 4. But with the last book, The Dark Tower, there is a very divisive ending to this book. And this will be totally spoiler-free, but I'll just say that I can see why it was divisive. I personally did not have a huge emotional experience with the very ending of the book. I think it made sense. I just agreed with everything King said in the afterword of that book. It made sense. The journey was the most important part anyway, but I just felt like I might have expected more considering how many risks King took throughout the series and what he did differently. I just thought he might take a few more risks with that ending than he did, but it was still well written. I agree that I couldn't see it ending any other way. And then other parts of the last book, I did feel as though the resolution with certain villains was a little anticlimactic for me personally, but I did find that the resolution with certain characters was very emotionally effective for me personally too. As for other things too with that book, I did feel as though he introduced some new terminology, some new side characters, some new settings, and some of these worked for me, some of them not as much, but overall I still felt good about finishing the book. I guess I'll say that. And then with Song of Susanna, with book 6, this one actually did emotionally affect me more than I was expecting. I was invested in the storyline because I was invested in what was happening to this character Susanna in the previous book, in Wolves of the Kala. If you weren't interested in that character story in Wolves of the Kala, there's a chance you might not enjoy this book as much. And it did actually get me to care about certain characters I didn't think I would care about. So I thought that was well done. And as I said before, there are just some weirder and weirder things that happen as you go on in the series. I do think that with these later books, I think there were several moments that were powerful for me, that had me wanting to flip the page, had me wanting to keep going, and had me ultimately finish the series earlier than I thought I would. And that said, I still think that maybe the first half of the series was a bit stronger for me personally, and that's just my own personal opinion. I did love Wizard and Glass. That was my favorite book in the series. But overall, I can see why people love this series and why several friends of mine here on BookTube consider it a favorite series. And I guess that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm still processing my thoughts. I'm sure there's much more I could say about this series. That's just what's fresh on my mind at the moment. But of course, I look forward to future discussions on this series. And I look forward to hearing from you too. Do you plan to read this series? Have you read it? Are you reading it? Do you not plan to read it? I would love to hear from you. Please let me know in the comment section below, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.